Hello. Right. People are still coming in, but that's okay. I still like to get started. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Alice Blumenthal-Dramé to you. Now, Alice asked me particularly to make this extremely short. I hope I can cater for her needs, but I like to talk a lot, so that's a bit of a problem. Now, Alice is a professor at our English department here at the University of Freiburg. She studied English and Slavic philology, computational linguistics, and also general linguistics at the University of Manchester, at the Lomonosov University of Moscow, and at the University of Freiburg, where she received her PhD in 2011 and her habilitation in 2019. Now, in cognitive linguistics, and especially in cognitive grammar, we make a lot of assumptions about how language is stored in the brain and in the mind, and Alice, in her research, aims to test the cognitive reality of these assumptions by exploiting behavioral and functional neuroimaging methods. And the second big aim of her work is to understand the cognitive building blocks that are utilized in natural language use, to understand them better, their shape, their structure, their size. Alice has a lot of interests, not only psycholinguistic models, usage-based linguistics. She's an expert in language typology, morphological theories, and all this is mirrored in her teaching. She's teaching a lot of courses at our department, and we are really grateful for this. She teaches about language dynamics across the lifespan, major concepts in cognitive neurosciences, experimental cognitive linguistics, and also courses about the mental lexicon, and you name it. And what I like a lot about her teaching is how research-driven it is. There are lots of publications out there, recent publications. She has been publishing only in the last couple of years on very different topics, as mentioned before, on language comprehension across the lifespan, but also on online processing of causal and concessive relations. There is papers out there on perceptual linguistic salience. There are papers out there on frequency and chunking in derived words. And also, of course, a lot of entrenchment. And here comes a little personal story. There was a time when I was really, really angry about Alice, very angry. And that was even when I hadn't even met her. That was in 2011 when I had submitted and defended my PhD, and I thought, wow, that's a really cool text. And then 3 months later, I get her book in my hands, you know, the book that she had published in 2012, Entrenchment in Usage-Based Theory, What Corpus Data Do and Do Not Reveal About the Mind. And I was so angry because I felt I would have needed this. Why is this not in my book? You know, all of this, you know. So luckily, since then, I can integrate this book into my own work, and I still know a lot of people who agree that this book has and still is been a milestone when it comes to the connection between corpus-based research and psycholinguistic experimentation. Modern advanced linguistic research is interdisciplinary, and I think it uses mixed methods designs where you try to tackle a phenomenon from more than one side. And this is exactly where Alice's work comes in. She's one of the few who successfully, really professionally plays in 2 leagues, and I think that is awesome. And needless to say, Alice is a good friend and an amazing colleague. And now, without much further ado, Alice, the stage is all yours.
Okay, thanks a lot, Lotte, for your kind words. Thanks for having me here. Yeah, as Lotte already said, one of my interests is how construction status can be operationalized for psycholinguistics, because I'm very much interested in this nexus between cognitive linguistics on the one hand and psychoneurolinguistics on the other hand, and I would like to bring them together. And so one of my central questions has been, are constructions cognitively realistic, or is the notion of construction just a useful descriptive tool, which would be fair enough, right? But is it more than a useful descriptive tool? So if constructions are cognitively realistic, this means that they should have some kind of cognitive correlate, and this requires that all construction should have a kind of shared, so a common cognitive denominator. And this common denominator, in my point of view, should be operationalized. I can never say this word, so it should be possible to operationalize it. So it should be definable in a way that allows for measurable predictions. Okay, so we want to be able to say, if this is a construction, it should behave like that. It should elicit this kind of response in people processing it. It should be falsifiable, so potentially proven wrong, and it should also be distinctive of construction grammar, right? So I see a lot of research out there where people come up with claims that are compatible with construction grammar, for example, but they are also compatible with other theories. So this doesn't prove that constructions exist, right? So it should be relatively distinctive and also debatable. The challenge in this enterprise is that constructions can be very different, right? So it's very difficult to find a common denominator from a cognitive point of view. So what are my aims today? So first I would like to suggest that this common denominator could be chunk status. Then I would like to present what is known about chunks from other fields of cognitive research. Then I would like to give some examples of chunking effects in language processing. And finally, I would like to illustrate how the chunk notion can be used, capitalized on, to test the chunk status of possible constructions, both lexically substantive constructions, so lexically specific strings like I don't know, but also, and this is the new part actually, chunks that feature open slots. And so the last part of my presentation, the one focusing on open slots, will be a pilot study conducted with Lotte Sommerer on possessive noun phrases. Okay, so here is my outline. First of all, let me give you a very, very, very brief introduction into constructions, just to highlight why it's so difficult to identify a common denominator. But I'm sure that, more, if not all of you already know this, so I'm going to be quick. So first of all, constructions can be more or less complex, right? So a single bound morpheme can be a construction, but also a whole sequence of words like that's the way the cookie crumbles could be considered a construction, okay? And anything in between, complex words, idiomatic expressions, etc., etc. So they can be longer or shorter, basically. Another dimension along which constructions can differ is that they can be lexically specific, just like the single lexical item banana. They can be semi-abstract, like have a Y, which can be filled by different elements. So first of all, have can assume different forms, so it could be have, had, etc., or having, but Y stands for an open slot here that can be filled by different lexical items, like, for example, have a drink, have a run, have a swim, etc., etc. So This is relevant for the rest of my presentation because that's what we will be focusing on in our common project, Lotte and I. And then finally, we also have fully abstract constructions. I'm just mentioning that for the sake of completeness, where you have, something that is entirely schematic, like noun phrase 1, verb, noun phrase 2, noun phrase 3, as represented by the sentence or instantiated by Mary gave me the book, for example. Okay. And then the final critical dimension along which constructions vary is that they can be more or less idiosyncratic, where idiosyncrasy is the opposite of, regular, something that is regular. For example, all of a sudden qualifies as a construction because it does not follow general rules of English, right? So sudden is not a noun. That's the way the cookie crumbles. It's also idiosyncratic, but for a different reason, because it's semantically non-compositional. And I don't know, or how can I help you, are not idiosyncratic. Okay, so they just follow the normal rules of English. Okay, so one could argue about that, because obviously I don't know can be used in different contexts with different functions, but let's just assume here that we focus on I don't know as a regular string. Okay, now what's a possible common denominator that we can capitalize on for psycholinguistic experiments? As I said, my suggestion is that it is chunk status. And what does chunk status mean? There are a lot of definitions of chunk status around, and that's, probably the case because so many different fields of research are interested in chunks, right? In research on vision, in research on motor control, in research on language, etc., etc. So now we will just assume that a chunk is a unit of learning, a unit of representation, and a unit of processing. This could be disentangled further. Maybe we can do that in the discussion. Now, why can a construction, or what makes a construction a chunk? There are two potential reasons for something being a chunk. The first reason is that it is idiosyncratic. If something is idiosyncratic, it can't be assembled from its individual component parts according to highly general rules, so it has to be separately stored in our minds somewhere, okay? So if we didn't know if we were true speakers of English and we didn't know, all of a sudden we couldn't creatively come up with it. So that's something that needs to be stored as a separate entry in our mental lexicon. That's not really contentious, and for this reason it's also not really interesting, I think. This has long been known, right, in all kinds of psycholinguistic models about what is stored in our mental lexicon, etc. It's always been assumed that what is idiosyncratic in some way needs to be stored separately. What is more interesting and more contentious is the role of high usage frequency. Here, the driving factor is assumed to be economy, and simply what we do really frequently is supposed to become merged into one unit, like, for example, tying one's shoes. When we learn that as children, it's individual steps that we need to assemble consciously, and later on, once we are able to do that, it even becomes difficult to explain it to children because it's difficult to break it down because it's one chunk in our minds. And here, holistic storage is contentious. Now, it's generally assumed, I think, in the usage-based community that this is contentious, so that frequency effects are contentious, but I don't think that's really the case. I think that, so I've found quite a few citations, so I think I talk too quickly. So I would say that, to the best of my knowledge, nowadays, most people, even in the generative community, accept frequency effects. Okay, so that's not a very debatable assumption. The debatable question is what specific effect frequency has. And from the literature that I've read, what I understand is that generative grammarians would say that, yeah, of course, if we do something very frequently, if we say something really often, then we process it with more ease and speed. But this doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that it becomes a chunk. Okay? So we just do it more quickly, but we retrieve each individual part separately and put the parts together according to grammatical rules. We just do it more quickly. And I would say that the usage-based view, or at least my view, would be that frequency effects go further than that. Actually, the representation status changes. Things become a chunk. Okay, so the individual units fuse into a chunk. Now, a lot of research that has shown that frequency induces greater speed and ease of processing is compatible with both views. Okay, so maybe we're just using highly general grammatical rules and concatenating morphemes more quickly. This would be in line with, I guess, with generative grammar. Okay, so that's not very revolutionary. By contrast, if it was the case that the actual storage format changes, this would be more interesting. And I think that this is what is distinctive, actually, of chunk status or of construction grammar. Okay. And I would like to show that this is not only a distinctive and debatable claim, but that it's also testable. And another thing, as already mentioned, that I would like to show is that it's not only testable when it comes to lexically specific sequences, but also when it comes to constructions which are partially open, which feature open slots like have a Y. Before I can tell you more about psycholinguistic experiments that can be tested to check for chunk status, I would like to tell you a bit about what is known from chunks from other fields of research, because this has really been an important inspiration for my own research. First of all, many people assume that I think of chunk status as a binary thing. So either a collection of elements is a chunk or it is not a chunk. That's not how I see things, actually. So I think that for something to qualify as a chunk means that the whole is more salient than its individual component parts. But this doesn't mean that we can't access or see the individual component parts, right? So for example, if you think of a forest, or if you see this picture of a forest, well, you see that it's a forest, but you also know and see the trees, and you know that there are leaves, etc., etc. Okay? So the question is, what is more salient? And how can salience be operationalized? Well, either it's accessed more quickly than the parts, or more strongly. And there are different ways of testing that, and a very old paradigm that has been used in other fields of cognition is the Navon task. It's a really easy task, but it illustrates really well that sometimes the whole is more salient than the parts, but that this doesn't mean that we don't access the parts. Okay? For example, if you look at this big H letter, most people actually first see that it's an H, and only in a second step do they realize that it consists of little a's. Now, of course, you can play around with this letter and have larger individual letters and et cetera, but most people, so there are strong inter-individual differences as well. So some people are very bottom-up. They first see the parts and then compose them and then realize that there's a whole. So it's not a cognitive necessity, and it might also vary depending on a lot of interesting variables, like, for example, caffeine consumption, etc. Yeah, so that's what I mean by chunk. A picture that I show in all my presentations about chunk is the Dalmatian, so I will also show it today. When talking about chunks, often we talk about superiority effects, and these superiority effects illustrate again, that the whole is not constructed from the bottom up by composing the parts, but first we identify the whole, and only then, so after having understood what the whole is, can we home in on the parts, okay? So it's not possible, actually, to identify the dogs if you start from the individual dog parts, right? So the snout, the nose, the tail, etc. So you first need to have identified the whole dog, and then you understand the parts. So this is sometimes called cognitive precedence or superiority effect. So you need the whole to understand the parts. That's also familiar from certain metaphors or idiomatic expressions in English, for example. If you say spill the beans, you can only know what beans are when you know what the whole idiom means. Many people, or some people, I'd say 1/3 of people actually don't see the Dalmatian here, so if you are among those people, don't worry. Maybe it means that you are more bottom up in your cognitive style. But I also have an illustration that maybe you can see it better when it moves. Okay. Okay, and so these superiority effects are also well documented in language. Okay, this is mainly done by psycholinguists. Some research goes back to the 1970s or so with no connection whatsoever to construction grammar, but superiority effects or the lexical superiority effect, the syntactic superiority effect, etc., are topics that have been focused on in psycholinguistics for quite some time. I would like to illustrate superiority effects in language by focusing on the word government. Let's assume this bimorphemic word is a chunk. Why should it be a chunk? Well, probably because it's very frequent, okay? Government as a whole is more frequent than govern on its own. The whole is more frequent than the parts are in separation, so that's a likely candidate for something that is holistically stored for frequency reasons. By contrast, governor, I would predict, is less of a construction. So govern, and so the combination is rare, so probably in governor, govern stands out as a morpheme that contributes to the word separately, okay? Because governor is rarer than govern on its own. Okay, so if a sequence is a chunk, it should show superiority or top-down effects, and this means that the individual components of government should not be very salient, but the individual components of governor should be more salient. Let's move on to the next slide. That's something I will show you later I will show you a priming study later where I've shown this. First, I would like to talk about some other superiority effects, so you probably know that, okay? So that's a very famous experiment that actually started out as an internet hoax, but then someone from Cambridge University actually conducted a study and found that it was true. And now it exists in many different languages, and this illustrates the very famous word superiority effect, and it shows that most proficient, highly experienced speakers or readers, when they read text, they do not read words letter by letter, but they read them at a glance holistically. And this is why typos, jumbled letters, etc. are more or less ignored. I mean, here they are very salient, but it's also been shown that people are not aware of typos very frequently. Now back to my priming experiment and the idea it's based on. Or the idea that in government, govern should not be very salient because the government is a chunk, and that in governor, govern should be more salient. it is possible to conduct button press experiments, monitoring experiments, where you have people listen to text or to speech, and you ask them to push a button whenever they hear a certain cue, for example, govern. This hasn't been done with government and govern, but with other lexical items. And it turns out that when something is represented as a chunk, people are slower to say, yes, I've heard it. I've heard govern, for example, okay? Because the parts are not separately accessed. In another test that you could run would be a repetition priming study. And this is a study that I've conducted, and I would briefly like to show you how that works. So in a typical priming experiment, people sit in front of a screen and they see pairs of words. The first word is called the prime. The second word that they see is called the target. And they have to respond to the target and to say whether the target is an existing word of their language or not. For example, you could be sitting in front of a screen and then you would first see dog, and then there would be a brief pause, and then you would see cat, and then you would have to say whether yes or no the word cat is a word that you know in your native language, for example. And then the researcher would measure your reaction time to the word cat, okay? And if the prime and the target are related along some dimension, then reaction times will typically be lower, okay? So if you have dog, cat, people respond really quickly to say, yes, cat is a word, but if you have window, cat, then they are slower, okay? Because the two items are not perceived as strongly related semantically or along some other dimension that is relevant to language processing. Now, it's also possible to conduct repetition priming. Repetition priming means that people see the same word twice, basically. Okay? So you see cat, and then you see cat again, and then you have to decide whether cat is a word of English, and then, of course, you say yes, really, really quickly. So when the words are identical, when the two entries are identical, you are extremely quick. When they are somehow related, you are still relatively quick, but not as quick as for identity priming. And if the two words are not obviously related, then you are slow. And this is called repetition priming, right? So the quickest priming response that you can get when people see the same input twice. Now, this can be operationalized for investigating constructions. For example, you can present people with words like governor as a prime, and then they have to say whether govern is a real word of English. And what's your prediction? Would you say that when do they react more quickly? When they see government govern or governor govern? Any ideas? So government is supposed to be mentally represented as a chunk, okay? This means that the parts are not highly salient. And if the parts are not highly salient, govern will not be perceived as a repetition of something that has been seen before, because it's related semantically, of course, but it's still a separate entry, okay? But if they see governor and govern, they react more quickly. Why? Well, because when reading governor, they already perceived it as consisting of two parts, so this should elicit something that is very close to repetition priming, okay? So this shows whether people have decompositional access to something or holistic access, okay? So this was the basic idea for my PhD thesis, where I investigated words like that. So I would say that experiments of this kind can be used to test for the chunk status of more or less lexically specific strings, potentially also longer ones, so that's something that I would like to investigate not only at the word level, but also at the level of longer strings, but it's a bit difficult to implement with priming. What is still lacking is experiments testing whether constructions at intermediate levels of abstraction are cognitively realistic. So something like have a Y, okay? And that's where Lotte comes in because, yeah, we spent a lot of time thinking about that. So how priming could be combined with constructions that might be represented at mid-levels of abstraction. And as you might know, Lotte likes noun phrases a lot, really a lot. So we thought, okay, maybe let's conduct a little pilot experiment to see whether this can somehow be combined. And that's the final part of my presentation that I'm going to present now. First of all, I would like to show you the constructions that we are interested in. So in general, we are interested in possessive noun phrases, so something that can be subsumed under the fully abstract schema that you see here, okay? And Lotte took a look or made a COCA query and realized that certain semantic classes are really frequent after different kinds of possessive pronouns. In particular, what was very frequent was kinship terms, body parts, a bit more surprising for me, furniture, and also abstract qualities, okay? So we thought, okay, maybe it would be plausible to come up with the hypothesis that my plus kinship terms constitutes a mid-level abstraction in the constructional network, okay? So maybe that's something that we store separately, my plus an open slot for kinship terms. And maybe this also holds for my plus body part or my plus furniture and my plus abstract quality, okay? So our question is this now a cognitively realistic assumption? I mean, it seems plausible simply from looking at the data, but is it really how people store constructions in their mind? And how can it be tested? And well, we thought that the challenge is that we need to, well, check the existence of both holistic features, so the effect of the whole construction on the individual slot fillers, and open slots, so small-scale tailor-made categories. Our working hypothesis was the following. If there is a mental construction like my kinship term, then we should find stronger priming with a prime like my daughter priming nephew than my patient's priming nephew. Because nephew and daughter instantiate slot fillers of the same constructional slot, okay? Now you might say, okay, that's obvious. Anyone would have expected that, and that's not new at all because that's just semantic priming, right? So that's semantic priming between items that are similar. So this doesn't come from the construction. This simply comes from the lexical semantic contribution of nephew and daughter. They are semantically connected. So probably my isn't doing anything here. It's just semantic links. And then we thought, okay, then we need an additional condition. And this condition is that the priming effect that we find in one should be stronger than the priming advantage between daughter and nephew relative to patients and nephew. So the priming effect that we expect within the construction should be even stronger than semantic priming that we can separately establish. Okay? So there should be an additional effect, and this additional priming effect, if it exists, should come from the construction, and it's by virtue of sharing a shared constructional slot. Okay, now this was a very tentative thing, we were not sure whether we would, whether this would work at all, because most priming studies do not use primes featuring blank spaces. Okay, so typically you have one word and another word. But we thought, okay, let's try it out. And we used critical primes and targets from the 4 semantic fields that I just mentioned, so kinship, body part, furniture, and abstract quality. We had 3 types of prime types. So first of all, we had a condition where a bare noun precedes another bare noun. So for example, nephew, daughter. Then we had a condition where we have a possessive a pronoun like my before the prime, so my nephew and daughter. And then we thought, okay, why not also add she? So our third condition was, no, not she, but her nephew, daughter. Okay? And we had 2 kinds of conditions. In one condition, the prime and the target were supposed fillers of the same constructional slot, and in the other condition, in the unrelated condition, they were not fillers of the same constructional slot, but of different supposed constructional slots. Okay? For example, of the body part slot and the furniture slot. So they are both compatible with a possessive noun phrase, but supposedly represent different sub-constructions in the network. Of course, we excluded certain stimuli from our study, namely those that are non-transparent for the reasons explained at the beginning, so they are likely to be chunks, and also the most frequent sequences like my mother, which is likely to be represented as one single chunk because it's so frequent. Okay, so here you see again an overview of the different conditions that we have. So one condition was with bare nouns, daughter, nephew would be related, patient's nephew would be unrelated. Then we had the same with my daughter, nephew, my patient's nephew, which are identical to the first condition, but it can be used to see whether there's an additional effect of having my of the construction. And then we had the same with she. I think I'll skip details of the design. We can come back to that later. But the good news, I guess, is that we did find significant differences between different conditions. So what is relevant here is always to compare. So you see that here we have the bare condition, the her condition, and the my condition. Okay, so these are the 3 different conditions that we had. And red stands for stimuli that are related, so prime target pairs that are related, that are unrelated, and blue stands for related pairs. Okay, and so our expectation would be that within each group, pairs that are related should elicit lower reading or lower reaction times than pairs that are unrelated. We find this effect, but it's extremely weak, and for these 2 conditions, it's definitely not significant. Okay, so you see that reaction times are just a bit lower for related stimuli than unrelated stimuli in the bare condition. And this also holds for the her condition. I will come back, so I will try to make sense of that later. But what we do see is that we do find a significant priming effect only in the condition where the prime is preceded by my. Okay? And this is a difference of 23 milliseconds. So it's not huge, but it's significant. So that's partly what we predicted, or what we would have expected. So we were relatively agnostic with regard to her. We thought, well, her is relatively rare. Maybe constructions are not, separately entrenched for her. but my is a very frequent possessive pronoun, so it's likely to be separately stored with its own open slots for separate subcategories. So here I would say I'm not particularly surprised because I didn't expect anything. This here, I think, is good news because we find what we expect if there is additional priming coming from a constructional slot above and beyond semantic priming. What is a bit surprising is that here we don't see any real semantic priming. Okay? I would have expected semantic priming here. So why isn't it the case that daughter primes nephew better than patient primes nephew? And then I thought, well, maybe that's a time course question. So, you know, when we process words, this takes a lot of time, up to 1.5 milliseconds, depending on certain accounts, right? So we go through different processing stages. And one interesting and much debated question is when which stage is reached. Okay? So maybe we access semantic information that is lexical before or after information that is constructional. And now I need to reveal something that I didn't tell you before. So here, our stimulus onset asynchrony, so basically the interval between the prime and the target was 200 milliseconds. And I thought, okay, so maybe let's go down in steps of 50 milliseconds to see whether at some point we do find semantic priming, because if we hadn't found any semantic priming, this would really have been problematic. So this would probably have been a reason to say that the experiment didn't work, right? So I conducted the same experiment again. Everything was absolutely identical, but the interval between the prime and the target was not 200 milliseconds, so people didn't have so much time to think about the relationship between the prime and the target, but 150. And so that's after my discussion, actually. Yeah, so that's what I find when the lag between the prime and the target is shorter. So there we do find semantic priming. So this is all very, very tentative, okay? So it's really more a kind of tentative pilot study, a kind of proof of concept. But I think that this might suggest that we first access lexical semantic meaning and that then constructional knowledge kicks in as well, but later. So that's one possible interpretation. But yeah, we would be interested in hearing if you have any thoughts on that. Also, I conducted a third version of the experiment with 100 milliseconds, so people have even less time to think about the relationship between the prime and the target. And there the results are almost identical to the condition with 150 milliseconds. So there seems to be something going on between 150 and 200 milliseconds where people are no longer interested in, or not only interested in lexical semantic relationship, but they access maybe constructional knowledge. So this would be our preliminary and very tentative explanation. Okay, let's come to my conclusion, or to our conclusion. So I think that priming is definitely a very promising avenue for investigating the cognitive realism of constructions. I'd say that it's relatively well established for lexically substantive constructions because we can use repetition priming to see to what extent the individual parts are separately accessed. But I think we can be relatively optimistic, or there's some chance that mid-level constructions can also be investigated using priming with the paradigm that Lotte and I developed. And yeah, based on what we've found, I'd say that the mid-level constructions, my kinship, my body part, my furniture, and my abstract quality seem to be cognitively realistic. But this doesn't hold with her. Okay, so when you construct something or when you read something preceded by her, you do not have so fine-grained, small scope, tailor-made categories. There are many questions, of course. Is the result or the difference between my and her due to frequency differences or to something else? I don't know. It would be interesting to investigate the time course in more detail. And also, what I've presented to you was a very coarse analysis. It would make sense, I think, to look at the individual subconstructions in more detail. So what I've presented to you here is the average. So on average, there is this priming effect with my. But it's actually different for different constructions. So for different subconstructions. Okay, so it's stronger, for example, for kinship terms, but not so strong for furniture. Okay. Yeah. So that's the end of my presentation. Thanks a lot for your attention, and we're looking forward to your questions.